Hey there, you're listening to episode 122 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Cody, and I'm here with my co-host and brother, Keelan. Today we're talking to Russ Crosson and Ken Boa. Russ is the former president and CEO and current chief mission officer of the financial advising firm Blue Trust. He's spent over 4 decades working with families and individuals to help them grow in generosity and wisely steward what God has entrusted to them. Ken is a well-known author and theologian and founder of Reflections Ministries. Together, they are co-authors of the book Leverage, which is packed with practical wisdom and frameworks for understanding our calling and invitation into the generous life. Before we get there, this podcast has grown almost exclusively by word of mouth. For those of you who have helped to get this message out there by sending a link to a friend or sharing on social media, we want to say thanks. It really makes an impact. If you think this conversation or any of our conversations are thought-provoking and inspiring, take a moment and share it with someone. We've been blown away at how God has used these stories to make a radical impact in the world of generosity and missions, and you can be a link in that chain. All right, let's get to the interview. We have Russ Crosson and Ken Boa joining us today. We are so excited that both of you are taking some time to share with us. Russ and Ken, thank you for your time today. And I'd love if each of you could just take a few minutes and tell us a little bit about your personal background and your faith background as well.
Well, thanks for asking, Cody. I grew up on a farm in north central Kansas. I became a believer at a Billy Graham movie in the late 60s. That was the start of my faith journey. I went to Kansas State University, majored in mathematics, and got out and started coaching basketball and football and teaching math at a large high school outside of Kansas City. And then in 1979, I ran across a guy named Ron Blue who was starting a company to help Christians be good stewards of what God had entrusted to them. And I thought, well, I'm a math teacher. I know how to teach. I'm decent with people. I'm a coach. So put everything in a U-Haul. I'd never been east of the Mississippi. And Julie and I, my wife of 1 year at the time, came to Atlanta, Georgia to go to work for a startup financial services company, which has since grown, been around for 45 years now, called Blue Trust now. That's our name of our company now. But yeah, that's my faith journey, trusted Christ. I still get to teach. I'm still in the instruction business, as we'll probably talk about a little later in this podcast. But yeah, I love what I do. And as much as when I started, I'm coming up on my 44th anniversary here in a few weeks.
Congratulations.
Yeah, my journey's been radically different from most. And although I was raised I went to a church. My parents never went to church for various reasons, but they sent us. And one of the churches was a pastor from a Dallas seminary. And I made an intellectual decision to receive Jesus at about the age of 14, but it was never real. And I didn't really want to admit it to myself. I went to Case Institute of Technology. I'm a scientist. And as I studied astronomy and math and physics, I put away all those things. And because I didn't really knew I had in my heart of hearts to have a relationship, I just didn't want to admit it. So at the end of the day, I never met anyone who professed to be a believer for my 4 years at Case Tech. But by my last year, for various reasons, God stoops to conquer and got my attention through psychedelics of all things, and ultimately made me aware of the spiritual realm and forced me to become increasingly aware of the fact that I hadn't really known him in a personal way. The long story short, 2 of us led each other into Christ just after I graduated from Case Tech in 1967 in June. We led each other to Christ at the same moment of time. We were doing telepathic experiments on LSD. So it's hard to imagine what all that looked like. But at the end of the day, I knew that night I was going to go to Dallas Seminary because it became God's blueprint for life. I realized that's what it is. So I went there. It's a very strange story, I would admit. I went to Berkeley, California to start graduate school, however. So I was there in the summer of love in Berkeley in 1967 in Haight-Ashbury and all of that. And so I was a full-blown hippie, but I had become a believer. I didn't know any believers there as well. But ultimately, after a number of months there on campus, I decided to give up my graduate student deferment and to take the risk and go to Dallas Seminary, or at least see if they had accepted me. Long story there, but the net of it is I found myself at seminary 6 months old in the Lord. Then I had to go through a conscious worldview transition that took about a year after reading books by Francis Schaeffer just come out then. And I encountered a guy I'd never heard of, C.S. Lewis. So all these things made me go through the painful, agonizing worldview transition, moving away from occultism, psychedelics, and Eastern mysticism. That was a piece of work. So after a year, it all kind of converged together, and it's been a great journey ever since. The spirit, soul, and body, the whole process is united. And I love then to apply biblical principles to practical matters.
Yeah, I love the very different backgrounds that you guys are coming from and how he has really blended your stories together, up to this point in time. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more of some of your story and how God started to get some of your attention, specifically with regards to generosity and stewardship, which I know is a big focus of some of what you guys speak about now.
Well, Ken and I both knew each other back in the 80s when we were on the advisory board of the National Christian Foundation. It was one of the largest Christian donor advised funds in the country. So we intersected our lives in the 80s. And then here just a few years ago, obviously I've been in the business for 4.5 decades of helping people free up resources to fill the Great Commission. That's the purpose of Blue Trust. So we've been about helping people maximize their generosity. So I've always been in this space. And then Ken sent me something he was working on, so he can tell you how he was even working on this project to talk about generosity. And that's kind of what put us back together. So Ken, why'd you send me that outline?
Well, I've always been intrigued by these things, and the principles that struck me were so profound, but they were not being used. And one of the things that bothered me was the difference between giving with a cold hand and giving with a warm hand. And it became increasingly evident to me that a lot of people, they had holding tanks, which were becoming hoarding tanks. And so that money was being held back because of the identity that a person had with the pile. And at the end of the day, even if they've given this money away, it was still not being released for kingdom purposes. So there is this whole idea of an earthbound and versus an eternal metric, a value system. And I've always been keen on the temporal versus the eternal value system. So money and stewardship is an application of those in a very practical level.
So what happened was Ken sent me this outline because he was wanting to challenge people with this cold hand, warm hand, and really delve into the generosity space. And he sent me the outline, and he was talking about foundations. He was talking about finish lines and ceilings. And I said, hey, Ken, that's my area. Can I send you a proposed different outline? And so I said, why don't we deal with the principles on one hand and the practices on the other hand? Let you deal with the principles, let me deal with the practices, as I've been doing that for over 4 decades. So that's how we kind of coalesced. I've always been in the generosity space. Ken obviously wanted to challenge people to think more deeply and biblically about generosity. And so that put us together about 3 years ago. And that's what was the genesis of the book. And I think what we've heard from folks is it's kind of interesting to have a theologian and a practitioner collaborating.
And it was a nice symmetry, too, because there are 5 chapters on principles. So it's the foundation, and that would be my contribution. And then Russ did the practices, another 5 chapters. But we only afterwards discovered, Russ, remember this, that actually chapter 1 corresponded to chapter 6 and chapter 2 corresponded to chapter 7 all the way through. We didn't even know that. It was like a hidden code. So when we kind of put it together, it really was a nice synergy back and forth as we were putting together the study guide for this material.
Yeah, I got a chance to read through leverage, and I'd love if you could share, what does the word leverage mean in this context? And then if we could dive into what are some of these principles and what are some of these practices that we can not only sit with, but apply in our own lives.
The lever is a huge idea. It's a tool, it's a simple machine that increases efficiency. It amplifies a small force, and it turns that small force into a much larger one. So it opens up a whole realm of mechanical possibilities. So the Greek mathematician Archimedes has famously said is, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, I can move the world. It's a great image there. So, and we can't be on the world. That's why the term an Archimedean reference point refers to something not on the world, but off away from it, so that you can lift the world if you're far enough from it, if the lever is far enough away. So this book applies that principle, and that scope was solely on the material and the finite. But this book applies that principle and leverage to matters of infinite importance.
That's why we really like the title leverage. So we really like the title. You know, you're transmuting the temporal into the eternal. And that's the whole idea of a lever.
So maybe just to start us off and kind of diving into the book a little bit, first of all, why is generosity or stewardship, I guess, maybe as a broader concept, such a powerful concept for believers? Also an underappreciated one, I think. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I'll let Ken give some of the other reasons why, but the first one that comes to my mind is it breaks the power of money. Luke 16:11-13, you cannot serve God and money. It doesn't say God and power, God and sex, God and you fill in the blank. It says God and money, because they both vie for the throne of our life. Because we have this incorrect idea that money can give us all the things that really God wants to give to us. And so I think the very first thing that generosity is so important for is it breaks the power of money. When you have an open hand and you're starting to release it, you begin to realize it's not yours. You get your hands off of it and your heart is in the right place then. And I think that's the first one I would share. And I never understood this. I never grew up in a family of generosity, until I started working for this company 4.5 decades ago. All I ever saw was a couple bucks put in a plate as I went by on Sunday morning. But this idea of being generous and sharing with others was totally foreign to me. But I can honestly say is we all have a choice. We're free to accept or reject the truth, but we're not free from the consequences if we decide to reject it. And having chosen to believe the truth that you can't outgive God, and the idea of opening up my hands, it's just been a great journey. And I think that's what people need to understand is because their tendency is to want to, as Ken said, hoard it or hold on to it. And the reality is we're only free when we let go of it.
Yeah. One of the major motifs in this book is the idea of leveraging that which is passing away for the currency of that which will endure. So Luke chapter 16, as you know, the parable of the unrighteous steward, is quite remarkable because he praises the fellow for his shrewdness. He's cagey, conniving, and cunning, because the children of this world are more shrewd, cunning in relation to their kind. They actually live more consistently with the logical implications of their worldview than most followers of Jesus ever thought of doing. So we all acknowledge that the currency of heaven is relationships. So make friends for yourself, Luke 16:9, for by means of the wealth of unrighteousness is his conclusion. So when it fails, and that's when you die, there'll be people to receive you into the eternal dwelling. So if you are wise, you will actually transmute the lead of that which is passing away, your time, talent, and treasure, and to transmute that into the currency of that which is going to endure forever, which is the word of God and people. And by building God's truth into eternal beings, you're living wisely and well. So that to me is the animating philosophy underlying this book, it seems to me.
And I think, guys, in a summary, what we're trying to help people do here, 2 4-letter words, we're trying to help them be wise, as Ken just said, with their money versus a fool. And we get that contrast from 1 Timothy 6, where it says, instruct those who are rich not to be conceited, put their hope in the uncertainty of riches, but in God who richly supplies us with all things to endure, instruct them to do good, to rich in good works, be generous, ready to share. So the person that does 1 Timothy 6 and is generous, they're a wise person. The farmer over in Luke 12, however, God did not get after him about building bigger barns. There's nothing wrong with bigger barns. There's nothing wrong with having more. The problem was when he was not rich with what he had toward God. He did not start distributing that out. So he was called a fool. So I think what we're really trying to help people realize is we all have a choice. We need to be wise with our money, which would be a generous mindset, just realizing that we're a conduit, or we're a fool and store up bigger barns and treasures and not be rich towards God. And I think nobody gets up and says, hey, I want to be a fool today. Yeah. So I think that's really what we want to try to get across in the book is, and we even do a little motif at the end of the book about taking after Jack Foxworthy, where he says you may be a redneck if some of his comedy routines, we say you may be a fool if. We kind of put a few of those things in the book toward the end.
We also provide 6 reasons for giving, and it's a good summary. It's like giving as a tangible way to acknowledge God's ownership and provision. It's a very clear way of doing it. And it's also, we say it's an act of obedience to God's purposes because we're invited, empowered, and encouraged to exhort it, really. Giving, third, is a tangible way to worship and show gratitude to God. And I think this is a very clear expression through that vehicle. It breaks the power of money, as Russ also pointed out, and it helps us to prioritize the issues of life. But it also is done to meet the needs of others, and we draw spiritual rewards from the act of giving. So there's a lot of reasons that it's a bigger topic than people might suppose, because we know that Jesus spoke more about money. We say about money, but actually more about the eternal versus the temporal. money illustrates where our values are.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And you're talking about the wise man and the fool and this kind of motif throughout a number of different passages. And I'm curious from your guys, either your personal experience or also just from your experience working with and hearing the stories of many generous people, what is it that moves somebody from one place to the other? What is it that actually changes in somebody's mind that moves them from one way of thinking about money, wealth, and everything to this whole new paradigm, which, I know many people in both of these kind of sides, both of these frameworks of how they relate to money. And how do you move from one side to the other?
Well, my experience has been the first thing is they have to realize that they're a steward and that God's going to hold them accountable. And stewardship is the use of God-given resources to accomplish God-given goals. So first of all, they have to realize that the Bible does have a lot to say. I do need to be obedient, and I'm going to be held accountable for what I've done with what he's given to me. Now, that's easier said than done, because then what happens is they freeze up. I can want to be a good steward, but then all of a sudden it's like, well, what if? What if I go into a rest home? What if the market goes down? What if the tax brackets go up? What if my investment account falls apart? So what happens is it's one thing to have an intellectual assent to the fact that I need to open my hands and be generous, but then Satan puts in all these what ifs and people freeze up. That's why we've had a business that we've had for 4.5 decades, is to help people draw finish lines, help them realize that God's always going to meet your needs. And what my experience has been, you can always be more generous than you think. I made the comment earlier, you can't outgive God. I've never seen anybody give their way to the poorhouse. It's just an interesting conundrum. But I think, Kaylin, it's first of all, they have to be growing in their walk with God and realize that this is part of their maturity, is dealing with this money thing. And to him who much has been given, much is required. And unfortunately, it's sometimes harder for people to have more to be generous. They just go back and make more money because they just kind of like, okay, it's easier to run my business than it is to be generous. And so it's just an interesting issue. And I've been dealing with it with folks for, like I said, 4.5 decades. And it just blows my mind that you can show a person that they've got enough, but then they'll just still want to be stingy and tight. So it's just an interesting deal.
Yeah, that's good, Russ, because it also relates to what you mentioned about an accountability. It's required of a steward that they are accountable. And the accountability, so salvation is by grace through faith, but reward is based on accountability, to responsibility to what we've been given. So faithfulness to opportunity. And that's the divine equalizer as well. Whether you have much or little in terms of time, talent, and treasure, each of us has the opportunity to be faithful with what we've done with it. But here's the question we can be pretty confident we're going to be asked at the Bema. It's going to be, what did you do with what I gave you? Because it was all mine. So you are called to give an account. And it's Jesus's terms and his parables about that are not unrealistic. They are awesome because they produce the fear of God in that very respect. In fact, the ones who were condemned were the ones who failed to take a risk, because obedience always requires risk taking. And the way we honor him is by obeying what he calls us to do, which will always tell us to treasure the unseen over the seen and the not yet over the now. And that does take risk.
So, Ken, you might talk a minute about the gravitational pull. I think, Kaylin, the other part of this is the more you have, the gravitational pull of money pulling you into its orbit is even greater. That's why sometimes it's harder for those who have much to be generous.
Yeah, we are immersed in the world of the flesh and the devil, and all three of them have their downward pull. So it's inviting us to be tethered to the earth. So the gravity of the flesh, which is an internal component, and then amplified by opportunities from the world, and then amplified by the spiritual warfare. You have a downward pull. So the spiritual life is like walking up a downward escalator. So if you stop it for a moment, you're going down. There's no neutrality. So every decision matters. There's the spirituality of small things. If you're faithful in a very little thing, you'll be faithful in much. Unrighteous in a little thing, you'll be unrighteous in much. So good and evil both can increase at compound interest. So this really does matter, because really, do you want to hear well done, or just you may come in? And there's a huge difference between that, because faithfulness to opportunity, you will be pretty confident he's going to ask, what did you do with the time I gave you, the talent, and why did you hold that back and hold it for yourself? So I'm trying to get people realistic about the whole idea of loving and having a sense of reward, because Jesus is unblushing in his promises of reward, as C.S. Lewis puts it in The Weight of Glory. And it's just unblushing promises, but most people settle for trivial and toys and tinsel.
Now, in this book, the two of you cover quite a bit of ground in this context around generosity, and we've gotten the pleasure of hearing a lot of these concepts through story on this podcast. And there's all kinds of different dimensions of generosity. There's where you give, there's when you give, there's what you give, and certainly how much you give, which I think, just thinking of my own story, when I was a new believer, I had one framework for how much to give, which was 10%. That just seemed like the rule and the target. And that's also the point where you stop worrying about, am I giving enough? I would love to dive in, especially this being the Finish Line podcast. We started around exploring this question of how much should I give, and really flipping on its head to how much should we keep as stewards, as managers. I'd love to hear some principles and also some practices around this concept of how much should believers give.
It's fascinating to me that when you think about the 10%, it's intriguing that there was more than 10% in the Old Testament. As you know, there was the Levitical. Well, first of all, everything is gift and grace. We all know that. And so it's all his. But at the same time, there were 4 tithes, as I now see it. First of all, there was the Levitical tithe in Numbers 18. But then there was a tithe of the feast in Deuteronomy 14, which is a fascinating thing. So 2 annual tithes. One of the tithes was that they would take every 10% of what they had and to go up and have a feast in the city that will appoint for you, which of course would be Jerusalem. And then you're going to spend it on whatever your heart desires, which is a pretty lavish thing because God loves generosity and extravagance and hates stinginess and hoarding. So it would actually force them to be more dependent upon God in that context. So that was a second tithe. And then there was a triannual tithe for the poor every 3 years. And then as I see it, I haven't read this elsewhere, but I think it's quite true. Consider the passive tithe of not being able to glean all the way to the edge of your field, number one, and not to beat a fruit tree more than once, and not to have one grape harvest. You're going to lose about 10% passively for the poor, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. So that's God's brilliant way of providing for those needs of others. So that was an image, of course, in the book of Ruth that you can see that. So that's a passive tithe. When you put that together, you're talking about 33.5%. Now it gets interesting. So the reality is that as I see it, in the New Testament, we would love to be told, here's how much you must give and here's what you must do. But it has to do with the actual listening to and walking in the Spirit. Going back to my other metaphor, if we are being pulled down by the gravity of the world, flesh, and the devil, we have another option, and that's the aerodynamics of the Spirit of God. So that while gravity will continue unabated, we have a higher principle of actual differential lift that enables us to soar on the thermals of the Spirit, even in the context of the world, the flesh, and the devil, even in this darkness. So God's given us the resources we need, but now we have to have a bigger vision for more than what most people will settle for. And it's a biblical vision that's more dramatic and radical and related to listening to his Spirit and being guided by that and taking risks. And I encourage people to bump it up every year.
So it's interesting, Cody, you have done what everybody does. They've said the tithe, which means a tenth, but they stop there. And like Ken just said, if you want to be real legalistic about it and do what the Old Testament says, then you'd be at 33%. But the most interesting thing is God raises the ante in the New Testament, says, give according to how you've been prospered. 2 Corinthians 8:3, give according to your ability. And this is where it gets really hard, okay? So to answer the question, how much should I give? It's like, okay, I've got to really walk in the Spirit, ask God, get some counsel. Here's the thing. You need to have some accountability, because the point is, my experience is people can always give more than they think. And it's really a challenge. Here's my key to answering how much to give. You cannot answer the question, give according to your ability, as it says in the New Testament, unless you look both at your cash flow and your assets. See, what you just said, you probably gave 10% on your salary or whatever. And that's what most people do. They give out a cash flow. But if you're supposed to give according to your ability, you've got to look at your assets. Your retirement plan's going up, your business is going up, your investments are going up. Well, what am I supposed to do about that? So what people need to do, and I'm glad you guys call this a Finish Line podcast. Everybody has a finish line. And usually people say, well, it's just a little bit more. No, that's not true. We built a whole business on helping people draw a finish line, because whatever you're worried about, taxes, investments, inflation, whatever, there's a number that's enough to meet the needs of your family and provide. And then once you get above that number, once you've had the courage to draw that finish line, now you're free to give beyond that. So my experience is people can always give way more than they think. And it's interesting. We live in a country with a matching program, right? The government lets you deduct up to 60% of your income. So you may give away a whole bunch, but you're getting some of it back, or probably 30% of it. And so it's really an interesting deal. And then if you give away appreciated property and you give some of your assets and avoid capital gain tax, it's just a very cool thing that people can always give more than they think. And there's all these things working together. And so I tell people, whatever you're thinking about giving, add a 0 to it or multiply by 2. I mean, seriously. I mean, if what you're thinking, I'm going to give 10,000, well, why don't you give 100 or why don't you give 20? I mean, and my experience is it probably ain't going to hurt them. Mm-hmm. So it's just a little bit more, but you need to have accountability because here's the thing about stewardship. People say, well, Russ, you said we need to be a good steward, and stewardship is the use of God-given resources to accomplish God-given goals. What makes a good steward? There's 2 things that make a good steward. You apply these biblical principles we're talking about, number 1. But number 2, you allow yourself to be held accountable because you can convince yourself of anything. You can convince yourself, well, 10% is enough. You can convince yourself, well, I can't add a 0. I can't multiply by 2. But you need accountability. And the more you have, the more that accountability is critical because you'll never get to that finish line. You'll never get to maximizing how much you can give without somebody holding you accountable and saying, why not? Why not? Why aren't you at 50% of your AGI because the government matches you? People don't have a good reason. I've asked people all the time, why aren't you giving more? They've never even been asked. They just, well, I'm tithing, or as Ken said, I've increased it 1% or 2% a year. Well, good for you. But your business went up $2 million and your retirement plan went up $500,000. So now how do you feel about yourself?
You're getting excited about it because it's true. You're living on the edge of something that most people never seem to grasp. And the fundamental principles in the New Testament are so radical that you rarely see them implemented. But one of them is obviously giving proportionately. And if we see what that looks like in 2 Corinthians, to give proportionately is ironic because actually the more wealth people have, the less they give in terms of a proportion. So it's precisely the opposite. The poor give a higher proportion than do the wealthy. So they are not really thinking very clearly about that. But that's a much more radical idea because if the more I get, the more percentage I need to bump up. And that's a process, a spirit-driven process. And it's really a conviction as a thought-out resolution between myself and God that governs my behavior. And so if it's a conviction, it's not a command or something that it's exactly this amount, but rather it is going to be worked out. And as God shows us, and what does proportionate look like in my life? And what does sacrificial giving look like, especially if I have several $1 million or 100 million? What is sacrificial giving beyond their means? And it would seem that it would have to have some impact on their lifestyle for it to be categorized as such. But people aren't thinking it through. But Russ and I do believe that if people begin to get even a hint of the implications of this, it would release so many billions of dollars into the kingdom of God that are just being hoarded and held on to right now.
Yeah, in Leverage, Ken, you wrote about this concept of giving sacrificially even. And I think that fits really well in this context of we can pick a target, but it needs more context. And it's a little subjective to say what is sacrificial, but I think when we really ask the Holy Spirit to guide us in that, it is a very interesting dynamic that the more we have, the less we feel like we can actually give up, or it feels like a larger sacrifice. And Russ, on the practical side, last time we spoke, you said there's a limited number of variables or factors that we really need to adjust for when setting a finish line. And I thought that was a really helpful thing to hear because as we know in our profession, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to quantify what do we have to adjust for and how do we make decisions after we've made some assumptions. So I'd love if you could share a little bit more about sacrificial giving and the variables that we actually need to take into consideration when setting a finish line.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think sacrificial, as Ken said, if you have a lot, it's really tough to be sacrificial. What are you really going to give up? If you're just barely making it and putting food on the table and buying clothes for your family and all that, it's easier to define sacrificial. But I think the more you have, it's this faith aspect of taking some steps to get beyond what you normally would do. And I think that leads to your second question, Cody. The things that people worry about, what if tax brackets go up? What if my investment account or interest rates and earnings go down? What about inflation? What about my lifestyle? And then, what about debt? There's certain financial variables, those being the big ones: investment return, taxes, inflation, expenses. What gets me is people, they're spending 20 or 30,000 a month to live right now, and they're worried about if they're going to a rest home. Well, that might even cost less than what they were spending now, but they're still worried about it. But my point is, there's software that you can put these numbers in, whatever you're worried about. You think inflation is going to be, 10%. You think your investment rate's going to be 2%. Let's just put it in. And guess what? There's always a number. There's always a number that'll say, okay, if you have this much, all these things could happen and you're still going to be okay. But this is where it's a faith thing, like Ken said, and walking in the Spirit. I mean, we don't know what tomorrow holds. And usually a lot of these giving decisions, you don't make them irrevocable into the foreseeable future. Just make a big decision this year. The market's up, my accounts are all up. Why is my net worth growing? If you don't have a good reason for it growing, then be more generous. And that's the thing. Just take it a step at a time and test the Lord and see what happens. And I think that's the journey I think God wants us on, is this idea of being, as I love Ken's word, radical, being radically different. The New Testament said, give 22.5% or give 36%. We wish it told us, but it doesn't. So God wants me engaged. I mean, this year, my wife and I are giving way more than we did last year from a percentage standpoint, because God brought along some needs. So we just said, okay, we're going to meet those. Now, have I committed that to next year? No. And that's what makes it a fun journey. And it really is a journey and a process. I want to come back. You asked earlier about when. When do you give? I want to introduce a concept here so we don't forget it. And that's the concept of reverse compounding. Okay, so when should I give? And a lot of people, as Ken said, they give with a cold hand. They give when they die, or they'll do it later in their will. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have charity as a testamentary part of your planning. But we all understand compounding. The more I put away and get started sooner, it's got longer to grow. I'm going to have more. That's compounding. But with generosity, every day I wait to give is one less day I have to compound, because we all have an expiration date. We all have a date we go to be with Jesus. So reverse compounding is every day I wait is one less day I have to compound for my benefit in heaven. So when should I start? Sooner than later. I should get started now, not put it off. That's the warm hand thing. So I just think it's important for people to understand this concept of reverse compounding. Every day I wait is one less day to be storing up treasures in heaven, sending it on ahead. And I think that's an impactful concept, because we all, as financial people, understand compounding. Your retirement plan, get started soon, let it grow. It's got a long time to grow. Giving, you don't have a long time. And every day it's decreasing. Every day. I mean, after we get off this call today and tomorrow comes, we'll have had one less day.
I just realized, Russ, that one way of looking at the compounding, the reverse compounding, is the opposite of the rationale that's being used by most trusts and foundations to actually hold off and not give as much, but to compound it for future. So the supposition is that let's say in 1920, you had assets of 10 million. If they were released to the kingdom to specific purposes, or suppose instead we create a foundation, and by a century later, it's going to be worth, let's say, 100 million or 200 million, doesn't matter. The point is this, that you see the rationale, we have so much more to give. But the very principle of compounding is always based upon the temporal value system rather than an eternal value system. The reverse compounding takes a measure of faith to realize that the longer you hold off on a thing, the less you will therefore actually have compounded from an eternal perspective. So that they're just, one's a physical, and it's really looking at the metrics of men, and the other is the metrics of the kingdom, which is dramatically different. So instead of the nickels and numbers, or the attendance buildings and cash, or buildings, budgets, and body counts that churches will use to measure, and how we use things to measure and quantify and count and control and compare, instead, we are told to take the risk of pursuing that which is, again, not actually seen, but it's going to be a far greater. How can you quantify 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold? You can't quantify that.
Ken, I love all your engineering and science metaphors. I come from an engineering background in undergrad, so everything you say just like really resonates really well. And I'm like, that's such a perfect way to say it.
I should have used entropy in the second law. That would be.
Yeah, there you go. We'd lose half the people listening, but I would be right with you.
I know, that's grand.
Yeah, so I love the term reverse compounding because before leverage, I have not heard that term, but I think the concept is so true. And honestly, coming from the framework of if I hold on to money and gain compound interest in dollars and then give it all away at the end, then I'm going to have a greater impact. That relies on a very major foundational belief, which I think is not a correct one, which is that God is measuring our eternal rewards in dollars.
Yep.
And we all know God's economy does not mirror the world's economy. And he's not just concerned with a final dollar figure at the end of our life. He measures in faith. And I also love the term cold-handed and warm-handed giving because I think it's such a concise and strong metaphor for, how we approach giving. If all of your giving is done after you're gone, it really takes no faith to do that because you have not had to trust in any way. You know that you had the maximum capacity till the day that you died. To give now or at any time between now and your final day requires faith. And the earlier you give it, really the greater levels of faith. So it's really almost the opposite of what you would think in terms of just a worldly economics kind of framework. I wanted to come back to something that you guys both mentioned earlier, which is this idea of accountability. And I'd love to just kind of dive into what a framework for that looks like. Because honestly, money is one of the least talked about issues. People will talk about so many, pride and sin and all these things, but they will not talk about money. So where do you guys look for that kind of accountability? How do you encourage somebody to step into that kind of a relationship? Where do they start?
Well, my approach is always to look at the currency of heaven is relational. So the faith is really relating to the idea of what God is promising for the future, a relationship with him and with his people. So at the end of the day, we just demonstrate where our value system is by the way we invest our time, talent, and treasure. But it has to do with the idea of cultivating an eternal perspective in this temporal arena, which empowers us then to take more and more earthbound risks to do so because it's going to go counter-cultural. So I'll give you one example. A person who has a lot of money he's given to a donor-advised fund, it was very difficult for him to grasp that he hasn't still released it because it's in the fund. Oh, I've given my money away. No, you haven't. It hasn't been distributed yet. So the reason why there was such a reluctance is because it's a matter of his identity that's so tied up with that it became an extension of his being. And so to let loose of your own life and actually to give it away for others, this is what relationships are about. At the end of the day, the currency, it's when you go to another country, you have to exchange your currency. And that's what we're invited to. It takes no faith to believe that 1 out of 1 dies. The statistics really are impressive.
To answer your question, Kaylin, accountability, you want to look for somebody who understands what we've been talking about on this podcast. So somebody that understands that this is not just about, insignificant things. We're talking about storing up treasures in heaven. We're talking about living a life of obedience. We're talking about walking up the down escalator. So I need somebody in my life that will have the courage and the strength to call me out and challenge me to ask those hard questions. Why are you not giving away more? Why are you still growing your net worth? Why do you not consider this? I mean, this will sound self-serving, but in our business, that's really what we do. We help you make financial decisions, hold you accountable, which leads to peace of mind. And left to yourself without accountability, you'll just drift. You'll just drift after the world. You'll just put more in the donor advice fund, like Ken said. You'll just give the 10%, as Cody said earlier. So I think it's important to find somebody that has the courage. Now, this can be, and it could be your pastor, it could be a close friend, but I have found that it needs to be somebody that kind of understands some of what we're talking about, that you need to give out of your assets. You need to give not just out of cash flow. Somebody that kind of understands the financial world well enough to know, hey, maybe you should put a foundation in your wills to catch whatever doesn't get given away during your lifetime. But I think the thing is somebody that's strong enough and courageous enough to say, hey, To him, much has been given, much is required. I know I've got a longtime client, and he turned white the first time I challenged him to give six figures. Okay? I mean, because it was so far out of his thing, but then he did it. I think it's in the book. I think I used that as an illustration in one of the chapters. But, you just need somebody that is willing to say, hey, you can do more. And guess what? They have to decide. Here's the other thing about accountability and stewardship. We're all going to stand before God. I'm looking at the four of you on this podcast here, and I see four pictures, and each one of us is going to stand before God. So, Caitlin, you've got to decide. You're going to stand before God. Cody, you're going to stand before God. Ken's going to stand before God. And so guess what? I need to hold you accountable, but you're going to stand before God. So my job as an accountability partner is to challenge you. But guess what? I have enough trouble trying to figure out these answers for my wife and I, right? What are we going to do? So we hear job well done. And so I think the biggest thing is somebody courageous enough to move into this space. And like you said, when it comes to money, people don't want to talk about it. And I think that's why, groups like Blue Trust, Kingdom Advisors, people like this are in existence now to try to give you a better kingdom advice.
You're framing it in terms of positive rewards because God never tells us to give up something without giving us a better good. Now, the issue is going to be, though, who defines what good is? So, as Jonathan Edwards made it very clear, the wisdom is to treat things according to their true value. And most people then use the metrics of the world is reversed with the metrics of the kingdom of God. So they do not live wisely. So the smartest thing I can do is to say this is in your own best interests in the long run. If you want to hear the well done, because how long is this life going to be? And number your days. You don't know if you don't even presume on a year, on a day. So if we're wise, I'll live each day in light of that day so that I'm going to give an account. So will it be well? Just imagine you're speaking to Jesus at the judgment seat. Will you be able to give a good account? It's just inviting them to be prudent and wise and to see that this is in their best interests in the long run.
Now, assuming that you have gotten the conversation around money actually started, I've realized that another tricky conversation is about where to give. And I think there are some legitimate reasons why people are hesitant to advise in this space, whether it's pastors, financial advisors, people in generosity-focused ministry. Could each of you share some of your thoughts around why it is important to have this conversation, and then also any thoughts on how we should think about where to give?
Well, the Bible's pretty clear. You give to those where you're being fed. So, your local church, you give to poor and needy, you give to promote the gospel, evangelism, discipleship. So we're given some big broad brush categories of where to give. And what I've experienced is, at least early in my career, is people would give to their church and they'd give to ministries that God had brought into their lives. And they never really had a question as to where to give. But guess what's happened in the last 4 decades? The amount to be given has gotten so big, they don't have any places to give it anymore. And so they've kind of frozen up. Adding a zero to what they're giving to the church may not be good or whatever. So now what we're finding, Cody, is that people need help, kind of maybe putting together mutual funds of giving opportunities. If you're interested in poor and needy or 1040 window or the marriage ministry or camping ministry. So I think where in a broad brush is evangelism, discipleship, poor and needy, those that teach you and all that. But then specifics will be based on the individual. And I think what happens is if a person is frozen, like Ken said, getting that money out of the foundation, they may need some help. We've just recently created a philanthropic consulting service to help clients with, hey, they're busy running their business. They don't have time to vet everything. So then they say, well, I got to be a good steward. I can't give them more money because I haven't had time to vet them. That's not a good place to be. So hire somebody. You hire professional investment managers, right, to help you manage your financial capital. You may have to hire a professional philanthropic advisor to give you alternatives. If you have to give away $5 million, that may be hard for you to do. But if there's some alternatives out there in these different segments, then it may make it easier to give it away. So broad brush, there are certain places in Scripture we're told where to give, but then specifically with specific ministries, you may have to categorize them based on the class of investment or class of, it's kind of like investment categories, right? Now you have giving categories.
That's what we do in the appendix itself, because we're 3 basic categories or answers to that question. Number 1, the ministries of God's word. So that could include evangelism ministry and preaching ministry and teaching and discipleship. Those four are especially key, and we have some scriptures that support that. And then the second category would be the ministry of God's mercy, and that would be including poor and needy. It would include those who are prisoners, food, clothing, and shelter, and healing and recovery. Then the third general category is ministries of God's justice, widows and orphans, oppressed, helpless victims, and so forth. But here's one key: no matter where you do give, it needs to speak to their spiritual needs as well as just the physical component, because it does little good for a person to be made more comfortable in the way to a Christless eternity if you do not convey the gospel itself, so that there's wisdom when giving those ways as well as discerning. But so using wisdom, biblical principles, but also counsel, and then, of course, the guiding of the Spirit of God. But we have that in the appendix that helps a little bit.
Now, there's also, and we've talked about a couple different dimensions here. I'd love to dig in a little bit more to how to actually go about the act of giving. So obviously on the most simple scale is just making a cash donation to a charity or ministry of some kind. But what other kind of framework or considerations would you guys take into account into how to go about giving, especially as the complexity gets greater?
Yeah, so this is one thing that blows my mind is people that build their net worth and build their financial capital base, and they don't understand that you can actually give away assets and give away property. So good stewardship would say that if you have an appreciated asset, a stock, either publicly traded stock or even a business closely held stock, that ought to be considered in the how to give. In other words, rather than just writing a check, maybe I give that stock and I avoid the capital gain tax. This is where it gets so much fun. But this is where also the foundations can become useful, because maybe your church or the ministry you want to give to, they're not really set up to handle an asset. So that's why a donor advised fund is a tool that makes giving easier. So you could give the stock, let's say it's $100,000 value, you paid $10,000 for it, 20 years ago. You give $100,000 stock to the foundation. It's sold. There's no capital gain tax paid. Now you have $100,000 that you can distribute to multiple ministries. So I think think about giving appreciated property, and how is also using some of these vehicles. We've mentioned a donor advised fund several times to help you make giving easy. So I think that's a how. Also, these can help you do things anonymously. Sometimes using a foundation can let you do some stuff anonymously. That's another part of the how question. Maybe that's what you want to do is let it be given, and it can be given anonymously through the foundation as another benefit of using a tool like that.
Yeah, we talk about giving anonymously for various reasons, because it really does enhance a person's intentionality. And there's not a connection between one another and the obligation. And then it's not always best for the people to know as well, because then they feel obligated. And then it produces a kind of a mindset, because yesterday's grace becomes today's expectation, you see. So grace kind of diminishes, becomes entitlement. So to do it anonymously as unto the Lord is a purifying factor as well. Those are practical things, but we also talk about giving harmoniously. And so that's where it's going to be a discernment, where it's going to be in a marriage or in a church. There's a discernment process, a collective discernment, a collective wisdom. It gives us more than we would have had on our own as well. Seeing all of this as a multiplier is really the vision that we have of multiplying that which is passing away and turning it into something that's going to be extraordinary for the future. And in terms of the difference between the temporal and the eternal, there's no comparison, but far beyond all comparison.
So this is back to the definition of a lever, right? You're able to multiply what you're doing. And Cody, you ask how much. This is where it gets so interesting, because back to this illustration, if I give an appreciated asset and avoid capital gain tax and get a deduction for the fair market value, all of a sudden I've got a whole lot of tax benefits that has made my $100,000 gift, to use my illustration, probably only impact me 20 grand or 25 grand on my net worth, because I didn't pay 25% capital gain tax on the 90,000 growth. I write off 100. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. This is why it's so intertwined, right? I mean, it's like, that's why I can say pretty confidently, people can always give more than they think, just because of that illustration I just said. If they do the how right, if they look at their assets, I mean, it's just all integrated.
Yeah, it's funny that example that you used. You talked earlier about add a zero or multiply by two. And if you started with, I want to give $10,000, that's a cool example of how you could give $100,000, but it actually only impacts you 20,000, which is twice.
Yeah.
So I want to dig into the practical side of anonymous giving. And I've shared this story before that when my wife and I were kind of early in our generosity journey, she saw this opportunity to give anonymously. And it was someone she saw posted online, wanted a specific item, and she bought it, dropped it on their doorstep, rang the doorbell, and ran away. That's one way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. What advice do you have for how we can practically give anonymously?
Well, I've already mentioned one. One of the reasons for a donor advice fund rather than a private foundation is it'll allow anonymity. That's a real key thing. They can just, a check can be given to a ministry or an individual in need, and it's done anonymously. While I'm thinking about it right here, the other thing when it comes to giving that's kind of fun is what I call the God pocket. Some of the money Julie and I give, and the most fun money we give, is not deductible. We're just waiting for God and the Holy Spirit to impress upon us who to give it to. And so sometimes, we'll put it in an envelope and somehow it'll get distributed to a needy person. I remember one time I paid one of the guys in my Bible studies rent at his apartment. He didn't know it came from me. And it was so cool to hear him come to the Bible study and say, man, I got this money. So just like your wife did, I just think having this idea of being generous. Now you say, well, Russ, you just talked about stewardship. Isn't that bad stewardship to give it and not have it be deductible? I can honestly say the most fun giving we do is not deductible.
That makes sense.
Because it's meeting needs.
That needs to be taken into account. Don't make it just dependent upon deductibility, because otherwise we really preclude a lot of possibilities. But I think the whole idea of no uncertain terms that we exercise our faith without pomp and vanity. And so to me, anonymous giving has a number of benefits. I think it teaches people to look to God instead of currying favor with human beings. And also it guards us against a sense of entitlement. Again, grace degenerates into entitlement with the passing of time. What have you done for me lately? I'm sorry to say, it's because part of the human condition. But at the same time, this breaks that power and also releases us and purifies our intention. And to Russ's point, you get the privilege of hearing how the person gives thanks to God rather than to you, Russ Crosson, and expects more from you in the future, by the way.
Yeah, it was so neat. He didn't know it came from me. That was pretty cool to hear. But I think, Cody, so two things I hope you're hearing there is one, there's ways to give it anonymously. That's why sometimes you may use a donor advice fund. But I think the idea of, I call it a God pocket. It's money I've already given away. I'm just waiting for God to tell me where to give it and who to give it to. And that has really been a lot of fun. And I do that in all kinds of ways, But yeah, I think it's this idea that we're encouraging people to be on a generosity journey rather than trying to keep. And as Ken said earlier, hoard it. It's like, okay, God, I'm going to give according to my ability. The more I have, I'm going to be more generous rather than less generous. And guess what? I tell young couples all the time, they're just starting out and they're struggling to put food on the table. Hey, start with a 10% like you did. I guess that's a good place to start, but don't, that's why to him who has more, it's harder. People think I have more money, it get easier. No, it gets harder because I really should be more responsible. That's why, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than a rich person, right? So it's just like, okay, Annie just went up. You asked for a lot, I'm giving you a lot. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, to whom much is given, much is required. The more we have, the harder it is to give by faith, the harder it is to alleviate ourselves from the illusion of pride. And then it becomes the sense of our security as well. So those are all pulls that we naturally, 1 Timothy 6 makes that really clear, Russ. You quote that well.
Well, I love that verse.
I love the metaphor you shared earlier about the gravitational pull of money. Just like as the mass of something gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that gravitational pull gets stronger and stronger, and it doesn't get easier to give as you have more, which is very counterintuitive. But then once you've experienced it, it makes total sense. And it just makes me remember a long time ago, I heard a Francis Chan quote about that passage about the camel. And he said, so what was Jesus really getting at when he said, it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God? Well, I think maybe he meant it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. So, he's just getting to that point that, it gets harder and harder as you have more. I wanted to come back to something that you guys were also talking about earlier about giving from cash flow and giving from assets. And I think giving from cash flow is pretty intuitive, especially if you're doing some kind of a percentage system or something like that. But as somebody starts to look at their assets and giving down from assets, especially somebody who's maybe, farther into their career and has a lot of equity in their house and in retirement accounts and other kinds of investments and stuff, what kind of considerations should go through somebody's mind? How do they approach the asset side of actually giving down some of what they've set aside or amassed as opposed to the cash flow side?
Well, Keelan, that's a good question. I think people need to understand the definition of net worth. Net worth is a summary of every financial decision you've ever made. So I think what people need to do is see what's happening year over year. So if I was here 12/31 last year and I'm headed to here 12/31 this year, then I look at those assets and see, is there something I could give? Now, obviously, you're probably not going to give out of your retirement plan unless you're over 70 and a half. I mean, there's some benefits of that. But if you have, like I said earlier, an appreciated stock, well, maybe you'll consider giving that. We had a guy who we started working with had Apple stock. It had grown dramatically. It had it for 15 or 20 years. He never realized he could give some of that. And so I think it's just this idea, and then it gets more tricky when all that growth is maybe in your business. But maybe then at some point I need to give some of my business away and let the employees buy it, or let my children, if they're coming into the business, buy it from the foundation. So you just need to be aware that if your net worth is growing, why is it growing? And do I have some assets that I might want to consider giving? That piece of land I've had for 30 years, it's just sitting there. It's an empty lot. Oh, I could give that away. So it's just looking at your net worth and asking some of those questions. And it does get more complicated, but I had a guy one time, he had a $173,000 note receivable. He'd sold some property in Michigan. He moved to Paradise Valley, Arizona. He was paying capital gain tax. This was back in the early 80s when tax brackets were 60, 70%. And I said, you can give that note receivable away. He didn't even know he could. So I think the biggest thing is knowing that you can give some of that stuff away and then get some help in actually doing it.
Well, Russ, right before this interview, you shared that you've been working on and have recently launched a study guide to dive deeper into many of these topics that we talked about and more. I'd love if you could share a little bit more about how that came together, how people can use it, and how to get these concepts in the hands of churches all around the world.
Well, so Cody, what happened was Ken and I were asked, a large church here in America asked us if we could help their donors, our legacy group of donors in their church. They really love the concepts and leverage. Could we actually help them? We said, sure, we can help you. So Ken and I sent them some questions for each chapter, but that wasn't very professionally done. So we've spent the last 8 months creating an actual study guide around the book, designed primarily for small groups or Sunday school classes that go into all these. So it's really well done. It's got some discussion questions. It's got a 30-minute town hall video setting. It's not just me and Ken being talking heads, but it's an interactive town hall video. So people listen to a 30-minute video, take some notes, have some discussion in their small group. Then they have some application questions to deal with some of the stuff you all been asking us, and then actually have a devotional for each day, and then some reading plan to go back and read the book. So it's a 6-week course, just hot off the press about 10 days ago, and but it's designed to help folks go deeper into the concepts in the book. And you get to be regaled with some of Ken's concepts.
We have a lot of QR codes in this study guide, and so it makes it really accessible so they can see these videos and they can take the pauses and so forth. So it's pretty user-friendly and interactive, and we're hoping that it will also empower and encourage people to use leverage as a go-to resource for these kinds of things for clients and working with actually people in the field. So we're discussing that possibility as well for other ministries as a kind of a go-to for financial advisors.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see how that grows. A lot of potential there and a lot of concepts that really are not discussed on a regular basis.
Well, it's interesting, Caitlin. Let me just interrupt here a minute. The people that first reached out to us went through with Ken and my cryptic 5 questions, and they said their people were so challenged with the concept of the tithe. What Ken had unpacked earlier, they just never even thought about that. So I can't imagine what they were talking about when they got to the idea of reverse compounding and asset giving. But that was one of the feedbacks we got from the group in the spring who actually just had the book to read. The concept of the tithe was a big discussion in their small groups.
It's more radical than people guess. That's the interesting thing. And always the biblical vision is always more counterculture, counterintuitive, and counter the narrative of self-gain. But actually, as we lose ourselves and he gains, and it's always been that kenotic process of the emptying of the self, and that he must increase and we must decrease. And the realization that that is my true path, because love, joy, and peace are never found as ends in themselves, but they're the byproduct of the pursuit of the one thing most needful first.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get to the end here, I did have one more question that I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on, which is, we talked a lot about setting finish lines and about, just sorting through a lot of these concepts. I think one thing that is in a lot of people's mind is, how much do I transfer to the next generation, to my kids or whatever else that looks like? How do you guys, in the context of the rest of the framework you're talking about, think through wealth transfer to the next generation?
We usually like to tell people, when your kids are young, 0 to 20, you err on the side of less rather than more. Maybe help them get a house, get started in a business. But what's the worst thing that happens to our heirs if we don't give them a lot of money? They have to work, build character, go through many of the things that we went through, live by faith, things like that. So less rather than more from ages 0 to 20. As you watch your kids mature from 20 to 40, you could maybe change the amount, okay? And then my observation is, once they're over 40, it usually doesn't matter. But here again is, what does the Holy Spirit say to you? What Julie and I have decided, this is where you have to balance current and deferred giving. We've told our boys, hey, guess what? We're going to give a whole lot more while we're alive to charity and to you guys, and less when we die. They don't need it when they're 60 and we're 80. So I think you have to balance current giving with deferred giving. I think if you're going to err, you're on the side of less rather than more. But see, here's what's interesting. I've seen people that they gave it all to charity and gave their kids nothing, and that wasn't good either. So this is where you have to seek accountability and wrestle with it. And the amount can change.
Yeah.
Here again, I wish the Bible told us, but I would say less rather than more, maybe more when they get older. Here's what I would say. Why would you ever give them more than you can give them tax-free? The government's given you an amount that you can leave tax-free. You better have a good reason if you ever went above that and paid tax. So that'd be kind of a cap, right? Maximum my kids would get would be this. And I'm not saying that's what you should give them, but there is a number that you can leave tax-free. So I would say don't give them more than that as a starting point. Now, if you have a business, that's where it gets more complicated, right? But that'd be kind of maybe a cap.
Yeah. I think you can ruin your children by giving them too much. And so it's a dangerous thing. And so it's a perspective of wisdom. And Russ's point about, he has a lovely thing that he uses in the book about the difference between the coffin on the one hand and then the table. Tell him about that, Russ.
The coffee table.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, to the degree there's wealth, if there's not intense communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. So when it comes to estate planning, there is going to be a family meeting. It's either around the coffee table where you're able to pass on your values, or around the coffin when you're not there. So I think that's the most important thing on estate planning, Keelan, is that once you make your decisions, if you're married, you and your spouse, you sit down and tell your family. Now, I've had 3 family meetings with my boys and their wives and explained to them why we're doing what we're doing. So, and it's a process. If you had to sum it up, it's a process. We wish we could say, I've done my wills, I'm done. But no, your kids get older. Your grandkids get older, your situation changes, your net worth changes. You got to keep dealing with it. And so, yeah, the fallacy of people have is, well, I don't want to talk to my kids about it. Well, somebody's going to talk to them about it. How about you be there to facilitate the discussion?
Yeah, wise.
Yep, I think that is a very underappreciated pearl of wisdom, and radically changes the conversation when you're involving you and your kids in the discussion, rather than just hoping it's all works out after you're gone and can't be a part of the discussion anymore.
Here's a visual for you. When your kids are in the attorney's office after you're gone, there should be nothing in the middle of the table they haven't already seen or heard about.
Yeah. It's the worst time is when inheritances are given and it can tear families apart because they hadn't communicated beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm sure many stories back that up. We've covered so much ground, and you guys have so much exciting stuff going on still in the midst of all this. I'd love to hear what you're most excited about coming on the horizon in the next 5-10 years or so.
I'm excited that we've got this study guide, and I'm just excited to see what God might do with it. We've been told that there's nothing in the churches, and this is supposed to fit that need now for folks needing to understand these principles. So I'm excited just to see what might happen. over the next months and years as we've been faithful to do what God called us to do to put this study guide together. And so I'm excited to do that. And obviously, I'm still excited in my business to help individuals actually do some of this stuff. And that's what we do. We're in the discipleship business, sitting with couples and individuals to help them draw finish line. So like I said, I'm coming up on my 44th anniversary here in a few weeks, and I'm as excited as when I started. So yeah, I'm looking forward to more years if the Lord tarries and I have health to do it.
As for me, I'm a generalist, a synthesizer, a translator, and an applier. And so I apply on the level of the heart, head, and hands, being, knowing, doing. So I want people to love well, learn well, and live well. So I create resources in all three realms. But what I'm particularly interested in addition to that, is as a scientist, my great passion right now is to enhance and empower people to actually have a growing sense of wonder and awe at God's general revelation. And so I want to use nature as a force multiplier of beauty, because in my view, the beauty of God's world points beyond itself to the truth of God's word. And so beauty is the back door to the Bible. So I'm working with the Museum of the Bible in Washington as well. We just did a thing on science, beauty in the sciences in July, and now we're going to be doing beauty in the arts in February 1, and beauty in the Bible as well. But we have a design charrette coming up that's going to be discussing how can we get this in a way that would create experiences for people to leverage the technologies that we now have, so that they can have a number of deliverables to give them a sense of contemplative beauty and awe and wonder on the microcosm, the midicosm, which is the biosphere, and the macrocosm. So I'm particularly keen on getting people to love God in his world and the beauty of his world, and then that's a pointer to the word. Then that in turn points to the goodness of the Father. So it's the Spirit, the Son, and the Logos, and the Father. So that's what I'm particularly focusing on now, getting those two together more, because most believers do not have an awareness, an apprehension, an acuity for seeing that the mystery in which they're immersed is vast and wonderful, and they're not using it to leverage an understanding of God's presence in their lives.
Well, as we wrap up this interview, I wanted to leave just a little bit more time for our Manager's Minute. And although this episode has been packed with all kinds of practical actions, we do end every episode with one practical action that our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and to manage God's wealth wisely. So Russ and Ken, could you each share one more practical tip for our listeners today?
Well, I'll start. I would think that you've heard a lot. It can be overwhelming. You've heard a lot of different concepts, and I would just say start where you are. This is a process. So don't try to figure it all out at once. Maybe you should give assets. Maybe you should set up a foundation. Maybe you fill in the blank. But I would just say start moving. It's easier for God to direct a moving car than one that's parked. So realize that you're a steward. And guess what? If you don't have accountability, you're not going to do anything. So practical action step, go find you an accountability partner that you're willing to help them see your finances and say, hey, would you help me as I engage in this journey to maximize my stewardship, maximize my generosity, and hold me accountable to make sure that I'm stand before God and hear job well done. So I'd go find an accountability partner and start moving.
I want people to love well, learn well, and live well. I want people to transition well so that they will finish well. My intention for people is that they live in such a way that they are prepared for the voice of the Lord, that they walk with him, follow him, and as they come more near to that understanding of his purposes for our lives, they grasp that God has called us for a purpose, and it is to honor him, and that we honor him through our wealth and through the resources he's given to us. He's given us on a temporal basis. And so let us live to hear the voice of the well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. That's my desire, for it to be a growing motivator, living today in light of that day.
Well, Russ and Ken, this has been a fantastic conversation. So much packed in here. This is one that you got to listen to 2 or 3 times to just absorb everything that we just covered in the last hour or so. Thank you guys so much for being with us. Thank you for all the work that you've put into leverage and making that available, and for where things will continue to go from here. So appreciate you guys both and being with us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thanks for having us. You all have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Hey, Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show. If you want to find any of our references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 122. Before we finish up, I have a quick question for you. Have you ever stopped to answer the question, how much is enough? The Financial Finish Line is designed to help you do just that. Our 90-day Finish Line Pledge breaks down the process into 3 easy steps. Step 1, define how much is enough for your family to spend in a single month, and use that as your monthly spending budget for 90 days. Step 2, as God provides money to manage, set aside any margin outside of your finish line into a separate bank account. Step 3, after 90 days, explore the millions of ways you can use the margin you set aside to create joy, purpose, and impact in God's kingdom. Want to learn more? Check out our website at finishlinepledge.com. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.